Miss Hope, we can't hear you.
I will now do this without being muted.
Now we can
Let's
hear
see
you.
how that works. I'm Hope Preston, and welcome to the Washington County Master Gardener Association monthly presentation. Our speaker tonight is Casey Clapp, an arborist, dendronologist, and educator with a passion for trees and the world they inhabit, our world. Along with being the principal consultant with the Portland Arboriculture, he is a co-host and co-creator of Completely Arbortrary, a weekly podcast about trees and other related topics, and he is the author of a new tree identification book, The Trees Around You: How to Identify Common Neighborhood Trees in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, exactly our book. Casey holds advanced degrees in forestry and environmental conservation, and he is an ISA board certified master arborist, a qualified tree risk assessor, and a certified urban forestry professional. And with that, Casey, I turn it over to you.
Fabulous. Thanks very much, Hope. Thanks very much, Tara, also for putting me on here tonight. I'm very happy to be here. Let me do this. I just got all my lighting set up because I'm at my friend's house helping them take care of their animals while they're on vacation. So I have a whole new setup today. So I'm excited that it's working out. Um, Again, thanks very much for the introduction and for having me here today to talk to you guys. I know you guys actually had a couple other things and you kind of squeezed me in because I have a big trip that I'm coming up against here at the end of let's see, at the end of April. A special thank you for getting me in early before I leave on that trip. I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end. But for the most part, it's going to be a trip looking at a bunch of conifers across the country. But like I said, we'll talk about that a little bit later. What I want to do today is focus on what I do, or what I've been doing for the last couple years, which is getting to know my local neighborhood trees. And the reason I've been doing this is because I've been, of course, writing this tree identification book, but I'm also just based here in Portland. And I actually was. We were talking just before we got started, and Hope, you had said that you had hoped to just walk down the street and identify all of the plants that you would see just walking down your neighborhood. And I have to tell you, I was doing that exact same thing. And that was one of the big reasons that I thought that it would be a good idea to learn how to identify these trees, figure out which ones they are, and then put it together in a book. That was one of my big moments while walking through my neighborhood during the pandemic, was just trying to think, what are these trees, and see if I could identify them just as a bit of a challenge. But I want to start with talking a little bit about kind of who I am. It was a great introduction. That is me right there, Casey Clapp in the top right corner, and that's me looking at a tree, a ponderosa pine outside Coeur d'Alene, probably I would say about 10 years ago now. And then just last summer, I had my friend Kyle help me take some photos for my website, which is me on the left. So there's, a 10-year-old version of how I change over the years. But along with getting older and growing my hair out and then cutting it back off again, I became a board certified master arborist with the International Society of Arboriculture. And I'm a qualified tree risk assessor and now it used to be down there in the bottom right, it'll say municipal specialist, but that actually used to be, or now is called, the urban forestry professional certification. So I've had my toes dipped in the world of arboriculture and urban forestry for some 15 years now. And I've worked everywhere from the city of Portland to the city of Columbia, Missouri. Went to school back in the University of Massachusetts Amherst for some graduate work after I graduated from Oregon State University just down in Corvallis. But what I did during that entire process was just kind of focus in every way I possibly could on trees and kind of how they interact with the world around them. And I initially started working as a storyteller just to myself and to my friends. And I would tell stories that I thought were fascinating that I would learn throughout college. And then during the depth of the pandemic, late 2020, I ended up talking with one of my close friends, Alex Croson, right there. And I pitched him the idea of starting a podcast where we rate and review trees. We just basically say, hey, I have opinions on trees. And what if we talk about that tree and then I tell you my opinion and then you tell me your opinion, and kind of came up with this fun scheme on how to introduce people to science and ecology and trees in a very strict sense. We cover one species of tree each week and then try to somehow bring in everything else that's related to trees. So whether that could be religion or food or ecology or other animals, insects, birds, anything that really uses trees in some interesting way, we wanted to tell that story. So we ended up creating the podcast completely arbitrary, which you can find anywhere you listen to podcasts, or on YouTube, you can find it there too. And we basically, for the last 5 years, have been talking about trees and other related topics, which is just our great excuse to talk about literally anything. So we generally focus on trees and in something that I think is fascinating, because I'm usually the big storyteller. I'm coming up with all these things. And I have talked about things like urban forestry and arboriculture, kind of like what you're seeing here is how are these people and those trees and that building and this urban kind of landscape, how do they interact? What is it that they are doing? And how does that affect the people? What is going on in terms of landscape design that allows these beautiful Yoshino cherries to be right there? And this is on Northeast Flanders Street in Portland. That's next to Stamtisch. And so I wanted to be able to tell those stories to people, but I also wanted to tell all these other weirder stories. I wanted to dive into the kind of faux science of, are there really these mathematical kind of things behind all of nature, or is this just us humans kind of noticing patterns that don't actually create any real thing or don't really seem like they are official or some kind of divine intervention? So we get to talk about things like the Fibonacci sequence and the spirals on different scales and around plants around the world. So that was like really fun, and I got to do this for 5 years. And then we started to expand out from all these kind of strange known ideas about trees, and then ask the question, well, what is a tree, and how do trees interact with their environments, and how do their environments interact with them? How does a fungus like this Fomitopsis, how does that affect how trees and forests grow? How does that little fruit on that that Cercocarpus up there, how does that how was that created evolutionarily speaking, and what does it do today? How does it make that species of tree so successful across all of the west of North America? And then we get to ask the question about the Canary Island dragon tree and others like it. Is this actually even a tree, or what exactly is a tree? And we can have these kind of really fun questions. So the podcast gave me this really beautiful opportunity to just explore and just wax poetic about everything I think is interesting about trees. Whether or not other people think it's interesting, it's neither here nor there. But we have had success, and people have tended to say, yeah, the weird stuff that you come up with, that's a lot of fun. But oftentimes what I do on my day-to-day is I talk about trees and how they grow, how they build themselves, and how we can interact with them, we humans, in our urban area. Now, of course, I do this as a professional arborist, and I go to different places and look at different trees in different situations. And for the city of Portland, I used to be one of their inspectors, and I would say, can this tree be kept or removed during some development? How should it be protected? What trees should be planted and what trees should not be planted in different areas? And of course, as an arborist, you get to do the hard, dirty work of saying, well, should this tree be removed? Is this tree dangerous? How is it growing? And we get to look at really amazing forms like this tree right here, which is a live oak from the Alamo, actually. And we get to look at it and say, well, we can actually retain this tree if we put in some cables. And you can see there's a few cables in there, here and there. You can see it has this amazing form known for these oak trees. And we get to be arborists who work with these big things. So having the opportunity to work both with the kind of really physical part where you're climbing trees, removing them, working in emergency situations where snow is coming down and you're the only person on the road trying to clear it for ambulances and things like that, versus talking about these stories and talking about how trees interact with everything else around them in different ways, really has given me this beautiful opportunity to kind of find how to deal and work with trees in the most holistic possible manner. And it's really opened my eyes to things I never knew and opened myself for different opportunities, which I didn't expect to come. One of them was writing this tree ID book. So over the course of, I think it was mostly 2024, but a little bit into 25, a little bit from 23, I got the opportunity to write this book because I quit my job at the city of Portland and focused entirely on the podcast and on consulting. And in doing so, found that I had freed up enough time to really focus on this huge project, the trees around you. Now, the reason I wanted to do this book is because I've just always loved tree identification. It was my favorite thing to do as a student. I would just pine to be one of the teachers who's doing the tree ID courses, and I never got the opportunity, not in college. But afterwards, I started doing this as a professional arborist, realizing that, well, hey, I can actually teach this to just about anybody in the arborist world, because arborists often don't have the same kind of background and degrees that you'd expect from someone who went through a landscape architecture course or something like that. So I realized a lot of people who are arborists, they just got into doing tree work over the course of their lives, over the course of getting a job and realizing they were really good at it, or they really loved it, or maybe both. And that then opened up this opportunity for me to start teaching tree ID to local arborists and to all sorts of different people. And of course, I got to write this book. Now, The Trees Around You is kind of a unique book in that I didn't write it in a way that was, let me just pick some trees and then just tell you how to identify them. What kind of trees was I going to choose was a really big question. So I ended up focusing on the Pacific Northwest because this is where I'm from. This is where I've done the majority of my work. And this is where I really just love the trees. We have such a huge, amazing diversity of trees that almost nowhere else in the world has the amount of opportunity to plant all the crazy species that we do here in the Great Pacific Northwest. Our climate has made it so that we can plant nearly anything across the temperate regions of North America, Eurasia, and Europe, all the way down into the southern temperate areas down in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, South America. So we get this amazing palette of trees. And I really wanted to A, show that off, but B, show that you could actually identify all these crazy trees, this huge diversity, without needing to get a degree in botany, without needing to become a professional arborist or anything like that. I wanted to cover the trees that people are finding all around them because, interestingly, the diversity, the highest diversity of trees in our region is not in our wild forests. It's not out if you go into the Coast Range or the Cascades or Olympic National Park. In fact, the forests, our native forests, actually pale in comparison to what we have right here in the city. Our cities boast hundreds and hundreds of species, whereas if you think only of our native species, we might have maybe about 65 or so if you include trees all the way down into the Siskiyous in Northern California, all the way up into BC. So really not a lot in comparison to what we have if we include all of the species that are planted. Now, the other thing that it really drew me towards writing this book is that there are lots of places where people live. And most of the books that have been written on how to identify trees in the Pacific Northwest are focused on the trees that you have to go find out in these forests, or the trees that come from the forests into our backyards and our parks and along our streets. So I said, well, what about those trees that nobody has, or that have been planted, that nobody necessarily brought in from our native forests into our urban area, but what about the ones they brought from everywhere else and they planted here? There are no books that cover that. So I thought, hey, this might be a really good opportunity for me to make that book that opens up the door for tree identification to just about everybody, not only the people who are going out into the wild forests for one reason or another. Now, what I tried to do is make it as easy as possible to cover as many different species as I possibly could. And I did this by making things like this quick guide here. And this quick guide is one of 24 that I have. And the idea behind them is that I wanted to show just exactly what it is you need to look for to identify a tree and kind of take all the guesswork out of it. I didn't want to leave trees in the kind of on a page that said, here's all the attributes for this tree. Now go out into the forest, go out into your backyards and go see if you can find them. It's always seemed a little bit too complicated for me. I really appreciate when there is a kind of gotcha moment for tree ID where someone says, man, I know that I see all these trees, but I just can't necessarily tell you, is that one this or is that one that? And how exactly do I tell them apart? How do I know what exactly to look for to parse out species A and species B? So that's what I made these little guides for. And this is one of my favorite ones because it's the scale leaf conifers. And I personally love conifers. I love scale leaf conifers. I love finding them and identifying them. And I think they are some of the most interesting and charismatic trees out there. So this is one thing, this is one kind of group that I heard a lot about that people said, man, that is the hardest group for me to identify. Conifers more generally, but the scale leaf conifers in particular. So I decided that I was going to take all the things that I had learned, all the things that I was teaching, and put them together in a really cohesive way that says, here's all the attributes to all these different trees, but here's the very particular things that you should look for to separate species A, B, and C from each other without needing to do anything more than flip over the leaf and find a cone if you can. But really, all you have to do is flip over the leaf, and most of the time you can identify those trees. Now, the other thing that I wanted to do is make a phenology calendar, and I didn't actually have a slide in here, so I figured that I would just bring my very first copy and show it off. I created this phenology calendar, and that is one of my more prouder moments for this whole thing, but also I think one of my I don't know, one of my bigger issues in terms of, I don't know, psychosis might be the right term, but I'll let you see a little bit closer what that looks like. So basically, what I did is while I was taking all the photos for this tree ID guide, I needed to figure out, well, what are the different trees that we have out here and how can you tell them apart? And maybe there's a way to tell them apart if you just know what time of year each one is blooming. So I ended up going out and trying to find every single tree that was blooming at any time of the year and mark down, well, what time is it blooming? What color is it? And then when does it stop? And I made this phenology calendar kind of for my own devices, trying to keep track of these things. Then I realized this is a really good opportunity to add another way to identify trees into the book. So now with the phenology calendar, about 100 species are covered. And all you need to do is go outside, see a tree that's blooming, look at that phenology calendar and figure out, well, what time of year is it? What color are the flowers? And then there will be a few different options for you to choose from. So like I said, I tried to make it as easy and simple as possible without affecting any of the not without affecting, but make it as easy as possible without making it too complicated. Try to make it as easy and accessible as I possibly could. All right. I did a little adjustment to make sure I could see what I was doing next. So let me know if everything is continuing as planned. Now, one of the big things that I always try to hit on whenever talking about how to identify trees and why it's an important thing is that anytime you are dealing.
Casey,
Oh,
it's not full screen now.
oh, it's not. Okay,
No.
thank you. This is exactly what I was hoping someone would let me know. All right. Thank you, guys. I'm going to close this, and then I'm just going to go back. Whoops. Okay, is that back to normal?
Yes, good now.
Great. Okay, sorry about that. There's a little behind the scenes look, so don't say anything. Okay, so I like to always make sure to tell people why I think it's important to learn how to identify trees. And one of my main rationale is basically if you are learning or if you're working on a tree as an arborist, or if you are giving advice to someone as a master gardener or some kind of person in kind of authority in terms of plant and landscape management, that if you can't identify the plant that you're working on, in my case, it's always trees, not always, most of the time, then there's not really a lot of credibility that I can take with me towards the next thing. So in the case of something like, say, diagnostics. If I can't tell you the species of the tree that I'm working with, then I can't, in good faith, tell you what's wrong with that tree, because I can't really tell you, is something going wrong with that tree? Is this what the tree is supposed to look like? If I can't identify a larch, then that means that I might confuse a dead tree with a living tree that just happens to be deciduous at that time of year. So learning as an arborist how to identify trees is the very first step in tree or in any kind of management, whether you're climbing it or treating it for some disease or telling someone this tree is okay or this tree is safe. You need to know what the species is that you're working for. But I always like to also include that knowing how to do things with trees is a lot of fun. Looking at all these different individual photos, these individual species, and saying, I know exactly what that species is, or walking around through your landscape during the fall or during the spring or right as the leaves are coming out, and being able to kind of read the hidden code that's around you and actually see which trees are doing what at the time, and learning that this isn't just a big green wall out in front of us. It's actually an entire group of trees and dozens upon dozens of species doing different things at different times. That's a lot of fun. It makes your entire existence around an urban area that much more rich, because you're not just walking by buildings and plants that have no meaning to you. You're now walking by a whole menagerie of different species that create a really beautiful way to walk through a place during a certain time of season, but also throughout the seasons. You can watch these trees go through their individual changes and really create a bit more of a special relationship with trees. Now, this I always like to add as or I always like to say as something that means like, hey, it's fun, it's nice. If you're an arborist, if you're in that one particular group, yeah, that's important. You got to be, the expert in that area. But it goes much further than just being a professional or being someone who has a really intense hobby that loves to identify trees or loves to see these kind of seasonal changes or interact with the trees around them in any way. It's much more important as a society for us to connect with the trees that we have in our area, because it has a lot to do with how we relate and how we care about our neighborhoods and our entire area. So knowledge is really the first and the foremost kind of thing we can focus on. And that goes all the way back to time immemorial. Learning how to identify trees is not something that we humans just kind of happened to pick up. It's not something that we just might happen to be good at for no good reason. We know how to identify trees because those trees, in the long period of time that we've been on this planet, have been important sources for food and important sources for medicine. And we've used all different parts of all different species of trees for just an unknowing amount of stuff. So knowing what a species is was not just something that was convenient or a nice party trick. It was more based on survival. In fact, we can tell the differences between the colors or different shades of green more than we can any other color, because, well, plants are green. That's the most important thing for us, evolutionarily speaking, to learn how to do. So, of course, we're extremely good at seeing what plants are out there, identifying them, putting them into different categories, and knowing which categories are more important and which ones, say, create medicine, create food, something like that. Now, this also helps with appreciation. Now, if we're walking around and looking at a tree, we can see a little tree like this one on the left, and we can say, oh, well, that's just a tiny little tree. Who cares? It's like, it's 15 feet tall. It's not very big. It's kind of a messy looking tree. Whatever, not interested. And then we can just pass it on. We can just cut it down. We don't need to worry about it. Or we can see this tree over on the right and say, well, it's not the biggest tree that I've ever seen. It's just kind of growing there. It's kind of funny looking. The top isn't, super uniform. Whatever. It's not really, it's not a nice example of a tree. Now, a lot of people, if they take that route, they would be thinking of a particular tree in their mind, thinking of a particular kind of, I don't know, archetypal version of what a tree should look like. And when you tell them, well, there's lots of different species with lots of different archetypal ways of going about their lives, then when I point out that this curl-leaf mahogany over here is probably something like 80 years old, even though it's only 15 or 20 feet tall, because they grow so slowly in such dry and inhospitable areas, all of a sudden that little 15-year-old or 15-foot tall tree is actually really large and big and ancient for its age, for its species. So It could be that that tree is well over 100 or 200 years old, and it's actually died back and regrown multiple times. So knowing that this species of that tree, or knowing the species of that tree, actually gives me a lot more information about it. If that was, say, an Oregon white oak, then we might be like, well, that's a tiny Oregon white oak. It's probably very young, versus a really old and ancient species of a tree that just tends to grow really small. And in the same vein, on the right side, that is a, well, I should say that was a Abies concolor, a white fir. Unfortunately, it was cut down for development. There are now multiple houses on that lot to the right instead of one big tree. But so it goes sometimes. But that was by far the biggest and best example of a white fir in this entire city. And trust me, I have looked around to try to find the biggest and the best examples of these trees. So I'm sure that there's some that I have missed. But that one particular tree was fully open grown from start to finish. It was about 2.5 feet in diameter. It was about 80 feet tall. There's not a single tree that even remotely came close to it in my experience of that same species. So it makes that tree unique, and it makes me appreciate it more than if that was just a Douglas fir or a grand fir or some other tree that we actually have many, many examples of. Knowing the species tells me that that tree is a little bit more unique and just a little bit more important maybe to keep around. Now, in that vein, it also leads you towards action. If you are able to identify different trees, then you know which trees are, for whatever reason, good or bad. You know which trees should be protected and which trees should be maybe let go because they're not as important. Perhaps they're invasive and it's actually better to get rid of them. Maybe you are now recognizing species and understanding how important they are, diversity, and also the just physical structure of a tree. And now you can say, well, we got to take some action to keep these trees around. We have to go change the legislature. We have to go to our city council and say, these trees are important. Let's put a tree code together. Let's stop developers from cutting down trees without any repercussions and try to rebalance the equation away from cut down all the trees for whatever reason to let's keep as many trees as we can for good reasons and replant trees where we have to cut down others. So having all of these different avenues to start to understand trees gives you more of a basis to create action, create conservation. And that, of course, brings us to the idea of plant blindness, which is a huge issue here in any modern society. Now, it's also termed plant awareness despairedness, PAD. And what it essentially means is people walk around and they don't really see the trees around them anymore. They don't actually look and say, there's a tree. That tree is this species. That's an important thing. Oh, there's another one. Oh, there's another one. It just ends up being a big grouping, a mishmash of green, a wall of just, there's green there. I take it for granted because there's always a bit of green all the time around me. I live in Portland, Oregon. So if you have that kind of that blindness to all these different plants around you, then you're not actually seeing those unique qualities and you're not really judging them as something that's important. You're more on the level of, there's a tree there. There's always a tree there. I don't need to worry about it. And then when that tree's gone, now you're like, whoa, oh, geez, where'd that tree go? And you almost forget that it was an important aspect to your environment, your urban environment. So trying to teach people to identify trees, see the nuance with them, I think it helps fight against plant awareness disparity, and it brings people a little bit more awareness of all the different plants that are around them, especially when you think of diversity. Like I said, 350 different species in my book. Easily, you could add another several dozen to that in terms of just the trees that are growing here. And that's not even including the varieties and the cultivars. Now, I noted earlier that that helps produce more action in terms of conservation. And this is something I think is really important because working for the city of Portland, working with developers primarily for 5 years, I learned that there's this idea that a tree is a tree is a tree. And that was always the most frustrating thing for me to hear as a professional arborist and one who can identify trees really well. I can see that, no, that is not a tree. That's a Douglas fir. Or that's not just some tree. That's a Douglas fir. That's our state tree. That's one of the biggest, tallest growing trees that's best adapted to our urban environments because it can take these kinds of harsher conditions versus the white fir that we talked about earlier, or versus an invasive species where I'm like, well, actually, the invasive species are the ones that should be removed. Let's move a building over there, cut those down, and let's keep all these native species or these better adapted ornamentals that are not invasive over on this side of the landscape. But it also became this issue of cut down a Douglas fir and plant a dogwood because a tree is a tree, right? And a dogwood's a tree. So if I cut down this Douglas fir, then if I plant a dogwood, that's a 1-to-1 ratio. That's easy done. And that was just mind-bogglingly angry for me. I didn't get angry. I mostly got frustrated because a tree is not a tree is not a tree. There are different species that do different things, that act differently, that mature in different ways. Some are really positive for the environment because they do certain things in our native habitats. Others are much more deleterious towards our environment and cause widespread degradation of the ecosystems that they're in because they're very invasive and they push out native species and they cause harm. So a tree is not a tree is not a tree. A vine is not a vine is not a vine, so on and so forth. So having the ability to identify trees and see these nuances creates a more it creates a better situation for people to actually look around and say, actually, we need to conserve certain things and we need to shift development towards something else. And so it really gives the opportunity for people to take action through conservation. And finally, it helps with stewardship. If you know what that tree is, you care about it. If I walk around a group of people and I don't recognize a single one of them, then I don't actually really know that I care for any one of them. Of course, I see people, I'm like, well, okay, they're people. I'm not going to, just do something crazy, but I don't recognize any of them. And it's just a crew, it's just a group of people I'm just going to walk by. Versus if it's a crowd of my friends, it's a crowd of my family, it's people that I know really well, then I'm going to see that group of people and say, oh, well, look at that. Yo, hey, what's up? And I'm going to be much more involved. I'm going to care a lot more about that particular group of people. And the same goes with trees. If there is a beautiful space of trees that just needs to be taken care of. Maybe it's the one in your backyard or along your street. Maybe it's in a park and nobody's taking care of these trees, keeping dead branches out, keeping holly and or keeping English ivy off of it, that kind of thing. Well, then we're not really taking care of our area. We're not really stewarding our landscape. And I think once people are able to see all the beauty in terms of the trees around them, they can then start to manage and help be good stewards of the area that they live in far better than if they just were told, go do something over here, go plant those trees, go get rid of those vines. If you actually know what you're doing, then your level of caring goes up significantly. And that is something I think is really important right now, is understanding that we are stewards and have been for millennia of our areas. And right now we're not doing a very good job. So if we can start to identify our trees and bring in this caring, then I think it'll really change the way that we are affecting our landscape. So all that to say, that's why I wrote a book on tree identification. That's why I love it to death. But I have got this question multiple times. It's like, okay, yes, I see there's good reasons to identify trees, but don't we already have a bunch of tree guides out there? Aren't there guides that people have already written that tell us all these different trees? And is it really a necessary evil? Do we need another one just out there to take up another shelf space? And my answer to that is yes. And here's why. If you start with tree guides like this, then you are in a really good place to learn all of the trees that are native to our local ecosystems. I brought this up a little bit at the beginning. So you would be able to go out into our native forest, into the Cascades, and you'd be able to identify every single tree and shrub out there, which is wonderful to do. It's very fun. It makes for a very fulfilling hike through the forest. However, most people don't live in the wild forests, and most people are not able to get out there as quickly as some. So most of the time when people are dealing with trees or plants or shrubs, they're not going out into our wild forest. They're going out to their local parks. They're going to their backyard. They're going to walk along their street, that kind of thing. So there needs to be a guide that focuses more on the horticulture species. So then, well, there's guides that are out there that do that. They talk all about ornamental trees. The famous Manual of Woody Landscape Plants by Michael Durr, who then worked with Keith Warren, who's out of J. Frank Schmidt Nursery. They wrote the Tree Book, which is a wonderful guide if you already know 100% what you are dealing with. So I say that because both of those books are about 2 or 3 inches thick, and they are filled to the brim with every possible cultivar and species known to be planted in the horticulture realms of North America. This vast, huge space with everything from the northeastern cold winters to the tropical summer times down in South Florida, all the way over to the very arid, dry areas in Arizona, California, up through Oregon. So all of those different trees are covered in these two guides. So if you don't know where to start, then these are completely useless to you. Now, most people here, if there's a lot of people who are already in the horticulture trade, these are probably pretty helpful guides for you because you know what you're looking for. You can open up your book and you can say, okay, it's all alphabetically organized, so I'm just going to go to Larix and I'm going to flip over. There's my larches. Okay, yeah, that's the larch I'm looking at. That's pretty reasonable. But if you are someone who doesn't know the difference between a horticulture species, something that has been brought in, an ornamental plant, versus a native, then you may not know which book to start with. If you have not been taught, here's all the different nuances with how to identify trees and what separates them in terms of botany, then you may not know where to start. And certainly if you don't know the species that's directly in front of you, you're not going to know the name, so you won't know what to look up alphabetically in these books. So my guide is strictly designed to be curated for the Pacific Northwest. So if the tree does not grow here, I do not include it. And the idea for that is if you're looking through something like the Sibley Guide to Trees, then you may flip through and find the oak species, the painting of an oak tree that looks just exactly like the one that's in your front yard. But oftentimes that is an eastern species. When you look at that eastern species from eastern the United States, you might be like, well, actually, I have no idea if this tree is planted here. It says it's not native here, but is there some reason that it would still be planted here? Or maybe this is a different species. Maybe it's one from Europe or Asia that's not very common, or maybe it's just not included in Sibley's guide because it's not a native tree, and he focuses heavily on the native trees. So how do you know where to start? How do you know which species are here and which are not? And that is a thing that I work very hard to figure out and put into this guide. The idea being that now if you are looking at a tree and you say, well, I have an oak tree, I'm pretty sure because I've used my diagnostic skills to figure out, is this an oak? Is this not an oak? What is an oak? What makes an oak? Then now you can go to this oak or the oak species or the oak section in the trees around you, and now you have a handful of species that do grow here that you may see but are not including the species that are kind of more far flung or a little bit further afield, the ones that you won't find in this region. I've omitted them entirely to make it as simple and easy as possible for someone to go outside, look at the tree, and identify it. Now, often, of course, this does make it a little bit challenging if you find that one species that is really unique that doesn't grow here or isn't planted here very often. But the good news is if you can get, say, already to the oaks, then you can look through and say, okay, I know it's not any of these really common oaks. That means it must be a little bit less common oak, and now you can start to look around. But it was really important for me to try to include only the trees that are common enough. And I used different tree inventories and went to Oregon State Landscape Plants, the database put on by Michael or by Patrick Breen, and asked myself, what are the trees that I know? I'm sure they are here. I've been a working arborist in this area for 15 years. Which trees am I seeing all the time? And I just made a big running list. Then I looked at which trees are planted here through local nonprofits throughout the Pacific Northwest. I looked at tree inventories from different cities and said, what trees have you guys found? And then I ended up creating a long list that made it as comprehensive as I possibly could without going overboard. So if a tree was not able to be found, say here in the city of Portland, then I questioned, well, is it really that common of a tree? Or maybe it's a tree that I have seen every now and then, but maybe I learned it on the East Coast, or maybe it's a tree I'm familiar with for whatever other reason, but it doesn't actually grow here. An example of that would be the American beech. The European beech is planted all over the place. It's one of the most common species we have. But if you try to find the American beech, which grows over natively in the eastern United States, it's just almost impossible to find. You have to go to parks or arboreta or specialty gardens to find an example of it. Otherwise, it's just extremely uncommon. Yet if you look around between the all the different guides from all the different trees that are planted, you might still find that. And certainly where I learned some of my tree identification over on the East Coast, well, years later, even at the University of Oregon when I was there, I also was taught the American beech, yet I had literally seen a handful at only specialty gardens. So cutting out some of the less likely species makes it very simple, yet can also say, also, if it's not the species, then go check out that other one real fast. And that's just as good saying, well, there's going to be two options. It's either A, or if it's not A, it might be B. But I don't need to tell you more about B. You can go find that out, or you're already led there because you know it's not A. So using kind of these kind of this method of elimination has been the real way that I have found Tree ID is most accessible for the most amount of people. So what I basically do is what I call the stepwise journey. And the stepwise journey is an ordered process of elimination that helps you figure out which species are which and which ones are more likely to be in your area, which one this species that you're looking at in front of you is certainly not, things like that. The main reason that I needed to do this is I would always teach tree identification, and I always get different questions about, well, what's the first thing that I need to look at? What's the second thing that I need to look at? How do I start to eliminate options that I know are not correct so that I can start to narrow down and just pick through the exact ones that I want? Now, many of you are probably familiar with a dichotomous key. Now, dichotomous keys I always really like because, well, as a very technical person, I love getting into those nitty-gritty details and figuring out which species is which based on all sorts of different things when I'm out in the wild. However, in a city, it's almost impossible to use a dichotomous key because, well, we have no idea where to end. The dichotomous key works really well with a nice, discrete set of plants. You have all the pines. Now we can say which pines are which, and we can start narrowing them down. Easy as that. But if you're just walking around in a city like Portland or Seattle or anywhere around, you will not be able to say, here's a nice discrete group of trees because it's not a native area. It's not one group of, say, all the lindens, all the maples, which includes, dozens and dozens of species. So how do you make something that is kind of like a dichotomous key, but works in a more urban area where you don't have the bounds that you can make? Well, this is my answer to that. And basically what it is it's a stepwise process of eliminating different species based on traits that you see as you're walking around. But it doesn't focus like many dichotomous keys immediately in on a tiny little particular detail, but rather starts with you first initially saying, what am I looking at and where is it growing? So I start with context. And context, I think, is really important because different trees will grow in different places. Now, this is a very common thing if you think of ecology. If you go out into wild forests, you're more likely to find bottomland species near water and upland species somewhere else. You'll find only the white bark pine at the very top of mountains, and you'll find other species of pine further down. You'll find certain species in particular places in these wild ecological zones. Now, I personally believe that there are also these same kind of ecological zones. I call them our domestic landscape, the different biomes and ecologies inside of it. And you can find all these different places within the urban area where there's a parking lot that generally has parking lot trees. And I say that somewhat flippantly, but if you've been through a parking lot and you can identify trees, my guess is you've probably noticed a lot of them are exactly the same species. You've probably noticed in business parks, they plant really tough species that are really cheap. You've probably noticed that in newer developments, there's a lot of very, very mass-produced plants that are planted along the road because they are cheap and they accomplish the goal of we must plant a tree here because the city says we must. Those kinds of places tend to get very similar kinds of species. I call them red maple suburbs, for example, where you can go out to certain areas in our greater kind of urban area here outside Portland, and you can find that almost every single suburb has dozens and dozens of big leaf or of some cultivar of red maple planted along the street, or Callery pear. things like that. Now, you can also find that there are certain species that grow along the margins of our areas of wherever we live, our domestic environment, where there are certain areas that we just kind of don't pay a lot of attention to. Perhaps it's the side of a road that is somewhat on the edge of rural and urban. There's not really something that's being intensely maintained. It's going to be a couple native species there, but there's going to be a lot of invasive species. There's going to be a few strange growing nut plants like oaks and walnuts and chestnuts that you'll find planted by squirrels kind of throughout the region, just maybe behind a shed or on the other side of a retaining wall, somewhere where you don't go very often. And that is the kind of area where you can expect to find certain trees. Invasive trees will grow just about anywhere, whereas non-native, non-invasive ornamental trees will be planted almost always very intentionally in the middle of a front yard, or like this Mediterranean ash in the middle of a street. So context is something I found very, very helpful. Now, the second thing is form and texture. And this goes from starting way back, looking at the tree and where it's growing, to coming in a little bit closer and focusing in on the actual tree itself, looking at the archetypal form. What's it look like in terms of its twigs? Because generally, the larger the twig, the larger the leaf, because you have to have a much more stout twig to hold a lot bigger and heavier leaf. It's got to move more water. Meanwhile, if it's a tiny little leaf tree, then it's going to have very small twigs. It doesn't need to hold up big leaves, doesn't need to move as much water and photosynthesis sugars back down. But then you can also look at these two examples right here and say, wow, I can actually just tell by looking at these forms that these trees look uniquely different. Without looking too closely at the bark, which is another big giveaway, you can see that the one on the left, it has very much more of a droopy canopy. And the one on the right, the canopy does not droop near as much. It's much more upright. It's kind of messy, but it just kind of grows up and out. It doesn't have the tips that really go very intensely downwards. And that is a big clue where you can at least say, okay, these are two different species. I can tell you that for sure. But if you looked closely at the buds and the leaves, being both birch species, their buds look really, really similar. They're very hard to tell apart. So looking directly at the buds is actually not a very helpful thing for these trees in the winter, but taking a step back, looking at the form and the archetypal shape of it gives you a bit of a clue that they are different, that they are growing in different ways, and that maybe that has something to do with them being different species. Looking closer at the bark then will tell you, these are two different species of birch. One is the European white birch, gets these really hardcore furrows on it, whereas the paper birch on the right doesn't do that. It has these really nice, easy exfoliating bark, but it kind of becomes not quite as white over the long period of time. So it's not a Himalayan white birch. So you can start to parse these things out without even looking at the buds right away. Now, of course, that isn't to say the buds are not useful. They are by far the most useful thing once you know what steps to take. But notice that I have them at number 3 here. So first it's the context, then it's the form and the texture, then take a look at the buds. And the buds are something that you should take a look at no matter if you are looking at the leaf on or the leaf off season, because buds will tell you what the leaf is. Is it simple? Is it compound? What kind of compound is it? And it will tell you if those leaves are oppositely arranged or alternately arranged. So here, the shagbark hickory is alternately arranged, and the European horse chestnut is oppositely arranged. So just using those two, just using the buds first and foremost, if you can start to say, okay, first thing, I'm looking at where it's growing and how it's growing. I'm guessing some things. I'm using the palette of trees that I've built up over my years of experience to say there could be one of multiple different palettes over in a wild area or in a kind of fringe of a landscape. And then I'm thinking if it's a parking lot, there's going to be way fewer ornamental species that I can choose from. Then taking a closer look at the buds tells you what kind of leaf it is. Are the leaves opposite or alternate? And then you can just wipe away swaths of different trees. If you find alternate buds, you know it's not going to be any of those trees that have opposite buds. So on and so forth with the kinds of leaves. So as you figure out the buds, that then figures out what the leaves are, because those are two intricately combined things. But then, of course, as soon as you start looking at the leaves, that gives you more information. You can see that the leaves of these two species are both compound, but they're very different, in terms of their compoundness. You can say they both have nuts of some sort, but the kind of nut, the way they pull apart, and what's inside is far different than looking at, or is far different based on these two different species. So we can start to use the buds to figure out what the leaves are, and then once we can narrow down different species based on those, then we can really go down to the leaves, the buds, the fruit, and the flowers to really know which species is which. And this is one of my favorite examples. These are all the dogwoods. These are four of our most common dogwood species. On the top left is the Cornus florida, the eastern flowering dogwood. Our native Pacific dogwood, Cornus nutalii, is on the top right. Then the bottom left is the Coosa dogwood, that is Coosa, or Cornus coosa. And the bottom right is the fun Cornus moss. That's a Cornelian cherry dogwood. And that's fun because, well, it doesn't look like a dogwood because it has no big giant bracts like those other ones do. Really, right in the middle of each one of those flowers, that is in fact the actual flowers of these flowers. The rest is just a showy bract based on a modified leaf. So looking at the flowers immediately can tell you the difference in the species if you know what to look for. The notches in the top on the pink flower, the 6 smaller needles on our Pacific dogwood, the really sharply pointed 4-bract flowers of the Coosa dogwood, and then of course the little teeny tiny no-bract flowers that bloom very early, probably in the next month or so on Cornus moss. That will tell you the difference if you can see the flowers. But if you can't, then of course you can look at the fruit and you can see the difference in the fruit. And this is where a lot of the technical stuff comes in, the buds, the leaves, the fruit, and the flowers, to basically help tell the difference between what species are what. And I go into much more depth into that in the trees around you. But I also, like I have noted before, try to keep it as accessible as possible, because telling everybody the technical versions of what each one of these fruits are only helpful to a small number of people. Maybe it's many of you out there. I would understand it, so you and I could talk. But for everyone else in the world, many people who are not as versed in tree ID or horticulture or botany, they wouldn't know. They would say, yeah, there's a bunch of berries. They're mostly red, but then one's kind of yellow. And that's kind of what they would think. So sometimes you have to say, great, yes, you did see a red berry, but let's talk a little bit more about what that berry looked like, where it came from, and what the buds and the twigs were like that it was attached to. And now we can start narrowing down the species. So you don't need to have a botany degree to be able to say there's a red berry on that tree and it had oppositely arranged buds. That gets you a long ways without needing to know anything more than that. So I really love to focus on that kind of aspect. And then, of course, I end with bark. But bark is something that I end on, and I always it's either something I end on or I start on. And I always love to bring up bark because either I see a tree and I'm like, the bark tells me it's this tree, or I go through this entire process and I say, okay, if it's the tree I'm thinking of, it'll have bark like this, and then I confirm it. Our dogwoods are another great example. They have really interesting bark per individual species. So I think dogwoods are one of my favorite trees to identify because every single part tends to be really unique per the species, but they also show how they're related so well that I think it helps to show people here's how species can look different yet the same all at the same time. Now, before we go, I always want to point out that conifers are the coolest, and everyone should like conifers more than everything else. And you can do the stepwise journey with conifers as well. Conifers are easy to identify if you know exactly what to look for and you know what would take away other different species. So with the pines, they're always in needles. They always have needles in 2s, 3s, and 5s in our area, I will note. But then all the other species have some unique attributes to their needles, whether they're in bunches, whether they are singly attached, whether they're flattened or triangular or square, whether they're sharp or pointy, whether they are, whether the cones are growing upright or fall down or have bracts, things like that, the size. We can go through the same process with these, although it's a little bit simpler because, of course, their leaves are always around. So we get a little bit of an extra clue most of the time. And if the leaves aren't around, that's a clue itself. That tells you it could be a very particular group of conifers, the larches, or it could be the bald cypress or the dawn redwood. So this is the fun part for me, of course, as a lover of conifers. I started out with it in the book, and that is the very first thing that I go and touch on. So this is actually another thing that I'll note right before we leave here is that the conifers, I'm going to be taking a huge trip starting in about 2 months looking at all the different conifer species across the whole country. So I'll be taking about a year sabbatical, and I'll be driving across the country, finding every species in between some videos and photography and a lot of writing. I'll be covering the stories of every single species of conifer native to the United States, which is 111 species. And I'm going to go find every single one of them, whether or not they're a tiny little shrub in the small mountains of California, or if it's going to be, the swamps of the bayou. I'll be looking for every single conifer species, and I'll be doing what I'm calling the Year of the Cone. So if you want, please ask some questions about that, or you can follow along. You can either get in touch if you have any questions, or my website has a bunch of new info on how to follow along, get involved, and of course, how to buy the book. But that's where I will leave it at this point, and I'll just tell you all thank you so much for having me and letting me kind of just talk for an hour at you about trees and other related things.
Well, thank you so much for this. Are you continuing your podcast while you're on the road? So can
A
we
little
follow
bit,
you?
yeah. We're doing new podcasts up until the end of March. That'll be the last time we do a new show. Then we're going to be doing some reruns, kind of revisit some old shows for the rest of 2026. And then after that, and kind of peppered in between, I'll have a lot of different kind of meetings from the road kind of thing, where Alex and I will get together. We'll talk a little bit about where I'm at, what I'm doing, what I've been seeing, and I'll be doing some audio storytelling. Basically, read some essays that I'll be writing per tree, and I'll be putting those onto the podcast. So you'll get an extra episode, but then a bunch of kind of fun episodes that will be all about me telling you about the story of the tree that's in front of me. So there's a lot of really interesting trees that we have not covered through the podcast for one reason or another, and I'm going to cover every single one of those. So I think there'll be quite a bit of content being put out in every kind of format you can imagine.
Wonderful. Okay, well, let me go to the questions that have come in.
Yeah, sounds good.
So Solia asks, is there a difference in winter pruning in mild winters like this one relative to very cold or very wet winters?
That's a great question. I know with very wet winters, well, it's more wet springs can cause a lot of issues with fungal diseases. But for the most part, if you're pruning during the wintertime, the trees will be dormant either way. And the reason that they stay dormant is that trees are not necessarily focusing on only the temperature or only the amount of water that's coming down through the season. They also are paying intense attention to the light and the length of the day versus the temperature and the moisture. So between those three things, the trees that are normally dormant this time of year will stay dormant. Every now and then, a different species will kind of pop early. Sometimes in a late fall that's really warm, the dogwoods will bloom again, our native species. But generally speaking, there wouldn't be too much to worry about if you're pruning right now versus a year that has a much more intense winter time. The trees will still be dormant, and this will still be a really good time to prune most of your trees.
Okay, great. And here Michael asks, does your phenology calendar take into account that plants seem to be blooming earlier now with our warming climate?
Yeah, it does, in the sense that what I did is, instead of saying March 31st, this tree blooms, that thing, that date, this thing, what I tried to do, because this guide is designed to be useful from Southern Oregon to Anchorage, Alaska, all the way out to about the Rocky Mountains, mostly just including Idaho. What I did instead is say early spring, mid-spring, late summer, things like that. So as those times shift, or if you are in Southern Oregon versus north in the Okanagan, you're going to have a different springtime. But the same trees will be blooming generally the same time if it is later in the season, or if it is no matter what in the season. So in the South, it will bloom a little earlier because all of the things add up that say this is the right condition, versus in the North, it would be just a little bit later. But you would still say, oh, it's not spring up here yet. So I tried to say in early spring, mid-spring, late spring, these are when you could expect these trees to be blooming. That way I can try to avoid the particular dates of the changing climate,
Right.
all those other things. It's a really good
And if
question.
early spring is a little earlier, then
Exactly.
that
Yeah,
is
yeah.
taken
So I
into
left that up
account.
to everyone to kind of understand for their own selves and say, well, what's the difference between late spring and early spring? I'm just going to look at all the trees in that area. So
Yeah.
mostly the idea is that if you see a like a pink flowering tree and you say, oh, it might be a cherry tree. I bet you this is a cherry. And then you look in that calendar, you're like, oh, it's not a cherry. Cherries only bloom in early spring. And right now it's August. So that definitely
Right.
can't
Yeah.
be a cherry. So it works in both ways where you can kind of eliminate different options, but also, know what time it is for you in your particular zone and use that to your best of your abilities. But there's nothing in it that's set in stone because that's the best way to find yourself irrelevant after a couple of years.
Okay. So Jack asks, what's your opinion of cities that adopt a list of approved trees to be planted in the strips of land between the sidewalk and the Hell Strip? Some cause damage to the sidewalk and wrap around water pipes, etc. But homeowners are restricted to planting only such trees. So you can tell Jack has an opinion about this.
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. Hey, that's all right. We all do. I have a whole podcast based on opinions, so I'm very happy to hear them all the time. Our refrain is your cones are your own because we make our ratings on golden cones of honor, 1 to 10. So I think that they are generally a good idea. And the reason they're generally a good idea is that the trees that are generally causing the issues are not on those lists. So red maple is a great example. Red maples are really commonly planted. Sweet gums have been planted for decades. Those are two of the biggest hitters in terms of causing damage to infrastructure below ground. So those are no longer on the list. So when the city says, thou shalt plant a tree, thou shalt plant a tree from this list, those are trees that have generally been approved and vetted over years of work. I've actually have been on both sides of this, being someone who's reviewing for the city, and I've also put in my own opinions with other folks around town. We've very much taken into consideration in the city of Portland, for example, definitely do consider who or what the species is, and is there any information about how it grows. And they have done a very good job of trying to get any of those bad actors off the streets so that only the trees that are planted in those areas that, if they are, it's not the best place to plant a tree. They don't really love it. So they also say, okay, these trees can't lift up the sidewalk. They have to be appropriate for this space and be able to take the conditions. And they have to be, tough trees that probably aren't going to cause a lot of trouble in some other regard. So,
Yeah.
in my opinion, they are good because though I love people to death, they generally make bad decisions unknowingly. So if you say, here are your list of trees that you can choose, it circumvents people putting in inappropriate species in inappropriate places.
Okay. And Gabriel wants to know, as I'm sure many people do, what do you think the future holds for the ash trees with the emerald ash
Mm.
border?
I think the future is very bleak, unfortunately. I have no clue how fast the beetle will spread, but it has already spread pretty quickly. So I foresee the native woodlands of our area crashing out pretty hard the next couple decades. Out east, I have been into the areas that you can just see heaps of dead ash trees all over the place. It looks like every other tree in a yard is just gone. Um, so I do not have high hopes. I think that the emerald ash borer will have a huge impact on our native ash. Some of them will certainly survive. We have a lot of them out here, but almost every single species except the blue ash to the east is susceptible. So in this book, I actually include the Manchurian ash, which is the native species that the beetle grew up with, that co-evolved. So it's more adapted. And then the blue ash, which is the only one in North America that seems to not really be affected. So those might be the only ones we really see in the urban landscape
Yeah.
in the future. But nature does crazy things, and it might be that there's just some genes that are about to be turned on in the native species that will just make it irrelevant. But who knows? We are closer to Asia than a lot of those other native species, so it might be that we have something going for us, but it's just yet to be
Oh,
seen.
And here Carrie wants to know, if you had a big yard with space for any tree, what tree would you plant?
Oh, it would.
It's got to be
It's
a
a trick
conifer.
question. I would not plant one tree. I'd plant dozens of trees if I had that kind of space. But that's it. Let's see. I'm a big fan of conifers, so I would probably plant some really strange conifers. Certainly some larches. I try to get as many different cold hardy-ish species from Southeast Asia as I could. The pseudo larch, the Cathia. I would probably try to get some southern hemisphere trees as well. The Fitzroya, I would really love to have a big one of those out in my yard. They're some of the oldest and largest growing trees down in South America. So I would probably have a really strange menagerie of trees that are probably not perfect for here, with a little bit of zone denialism, is my guess.
Okay. And the last question is from Kathleen. Is there a time of year that most evergreens have their cones?
Yes, fall time. Fall is usually when everything is going to be putting out their cones. Now, that is not the same for their pollen cones. So you can see like deodar cedar is probably putting out a bunch of pollen cones right now. Same thing with like the incense cedar and things like that. So generally speaking, the pollen cones, the little ones that fall away, those will be out kind of throughout the year. But in the fall is when I think every single cone that I can think of would be maturing for the most part. Yeah, that would be it. Maybe
Okay.
some of them take 2 years, so you're not going to see every tree with only mature cones. Like pines, they take 2 years. But everything else, it would always be during the fall time. That's when you'll get the best flush of cones.
Okay. Well, Casey, this has been a wonderful presentation. I have the book and I'm looking forward to really getting into it now.
Excellent. I hope you love it.
So thank you very much. And you can stop sharing and you can say goodbye. And everybody who's not a Washington County Master Gardener can say goodbye. And we will now move to our short chapter meeting.
All right, that sounds good. Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks.
And if you
Thank
want,
you.
just as a last thing, feel free to send me any of the extra questions that we didn't get to, because I'd be happy to address some of those. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah, just let me know.
Good to
Thanks very
know.
much, you guys.
Thanks. All right. Now, here we go to the chapter meeting. So I'm always exhausted at the ends of these presentations because there's just so much information coming so quickly that I'm trying to keep track of, but it is time to switch gears. So moving on to our chapter meeting, we were recognizing this month Ron Spendell. Many of you may know him. If you know anything about Mason bees, or if you've gone to any Mason bees classes, it has probably been taught by Ron. And he has built Mason bee houses to go in, multiple ones to go in both of our gardens and in gardens unrelated to us. He also has ones in other public gardens. So we want to recognize the excellent work that he has done. And I found in reading his write-up that before he ever got involved with Mason bees, he was a master composter. I'm not sure if I've got the term right, but he has more than just Mason bees in his background. So Ron, thank you very much for all you do. And I hope everybody is planning to come to our social on Valentine's Day, a week from Saturday, where we will recognize Ron there, along with all of the other activities that we have at the social. Other in reports to members, if you haven't renewed your membership, do it now. It's past time. We want to get the directory out, but we want to have everybody in it. So please, if you haven't done it, so do it in this next week so we can hopefully really like to get the directory out by the end of February. And as always, we have a few volunteers opportunities. We still need a few more people to be growing for the Grow One, Give One. I have volunteered to do that for the third year. I'm gradually learning how to start tomatoes. We've got tomatoes and peppers, and if you haven't done it before, then you will get lots of support. And there's a a class that or a audio call that discusses how to do this, and you can get any of the support that you need. You can even get help with the supplies that you need. So please, if you have any interest in this at all, please sign up. Go on to our member volunteer, the sign up page on our website, and you can fill out the online interest survey there. And even whether you are or are not volunteering for Grow One, Give One, they still need pots. So they need square, clean, square, black plastic pots, which you can bring to the social. Our propagation team also needs pots. They can take round pots, but these are black plastic pots. They can take round pots as well as 1 gallon pots. I just took a bunch over. It was so great to clean out my garage. I took a bunch over last week, and they can use more. And that propagation team, they are raising the plants that we are selling at Garden Fest. So anything we can do to have more plants at Garden Fest is a good thing. And I got a request from a community gardener at Intel. They apparently have a huge community garden for Intel employees. She said that they had 93 beds, and they were looking for somebody who could teach them about tree pruning. I would very much like to support Intel because we get a fair amount of money, donations from their employees and their retirees. So if there was some way that we could give back to Intel, I would very much like to do that. I, however, don't know about pruning. I would be happy to go along to this class, which would be sometime during the summer. But if there's somebody among us who would like to teach a class with support about fruit tree pruning in the summer, please send me an email or a text, and we can have a serious conversation about this. And lastly, a small team of us has been meeting about our strategic plan, and the next thing that we're going to do is put out a survey to the community about the things that you think we're doing well, the things we could be doing better, the things you'd like to be involved in, any new opportunities that you think we should be taking advantage of. So keep an eye out for that. And when it comes to you, please respond, because this is how we will decide what we want to be really serious about over the next 3 years. And then moving on to our calendar, there is our social at the Beaverton Library, 3 to 5, Valentine's Day. If you're going out with your honey, you can stop by the social on your way out to dinner. And then we've got several classes. The classes are starting up again. February 21st, we've got blueberry care. And then February 28th, we've got the complete mason bee. We always have more about mason bees. And then our next webinar, our next chapter webinar is Harnessing Nature, Effective Biological Controls, which sounds very interesting. And if you have any interest in following us on Facebook, we have a members only page to which, if you have some interesting gardening information or link, you are welcome to post, because it's only for us, and anybody who is a member can post on it. So thank you all so much. I look forward to seeing many of you at the social, and have a good evening. Goodbye.